The package had my name on it, but there was one problem: it had been sitting in a post office since 1989, and I wasn't even born yet. When the postal worker called me, I honestly thought it was some kind of mistake. Then he told me what was written on the back of the package, and my stomach dropped. He said, "You need to see this yourself." I drove there that afternoon with 100 questions running through my head. The package was old, stained, and covered with faded postage marks. My name was clearly written on the front. Not my father's name. Not my grandfather's. Mine. If you're into stories where family secrets come back years later, subscribe to Family Betrayal, because what I discovered inside this package changed the way I saw my entire family. And just so you know, the photos, faces, backgrounds, and scenes you see in this video are visual recreations meant only to help imagine the story. The postal worker carefully opened the package in front of me. Inside was a photograph, several handwritten pages, and an old hospital document. The photograph showed my mother standing beside a man I had never seen before. I recognized my mother immediately. But the date on the photograph was 6 years before I was born. Then I noticed the man's face. He looked exactly like me. I couldn't breathe for a moment. I kept staring at that photograph, trying to convince myself it was just a strange coincidence. But underneath it was a letter addressed to me. The first line said, "If you're reading this, your father has finally run out of ways to hide the truth." I felt cold. My father had been dead for years. And suddenly, I wondered what kind of truth he had spent his whole life hiding. The letter wasn't signed with a name. Instead, it ended with one sentence: "Ask your mother why she told everyone I was dead." I left that post office with the package pressed against my chest, but I didn't go home. I drove straight to my mother's house. And when she saw what I was holding, the color disappeared from her face. She whispered, "Where did you get that?" That was when I knew this wasn't a mistake. She already knew exactly what was inside. My mother sat down without saying another word. I placed the photograph on the table between us and asked, "Mom, who is this man?" She didn't answer. I asked again. Finally, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said something I never expected. "That man is your real father." I felt like the room had tilted. My entire childhood suddenly seemed like a carefully built story that had just collapsed. She told me his name was Daniel. He and my mother had been together before she met the man I had always called Dad. Daniel had wanted to marry her, but my grandfather hated him because he believed Daniel wasn't good enough for our family. Then my mother became pregnant. According to the story I'd been told, Daniel disappeared before I was born. But the letter suggested something completely different. I asked my mother why Daniel had written that he wasn't dead. She covered her face and started crying. Then she admitted the worst part. Daniel had never abandoned us. My grandfather had intercepted his letters, threatened him, and eventually told everyone that Daniel had died in an accident. My mother had believed Daniel was gone. Until one day, years later, she discovered the truth. But by then, she was married to the man I called Dad. She said she was afraid to destroy our family. I wanted to be angry at her, but I could see how much regret she had carried. Then I unfolded the final page from the package. There was a date on it. And suddenly, everything became even more confusing. The date was only 2 days before Daniel supposedly disappeared. The letter said, "I am coming back for my son." But there was something else. A hospital receipt. And the patient's name wasn't Daniel. It was my grandfather. I looked at my mother. She went completely silent. I asked, "What happened 2 days after this letter?" She finally whispered, "Your grandfather found him." That sentence stayed in my head all night. I barely slept. I kept thinking about the man in the photograph, wondering whether I had spent my whole life mourning someone I was never even told existed. The next morning, I went through every old box in my parents' basement. For hours, I found nothing. Then, behind an old cabinet, I discovered a metal box. Inside were dozens of letters. Every single one was from Daniel. Most had never been opened. Some were returned to him. But one letter had a different handwriting on the envelope. My grandfather's. I opened it with shaking hands. It said, "If you ever contact my daughter or my grandson again, you will regret it." My hands started trembling. Daniel had been trying to reach me for years. And my family had made sure I never knew. But the biggest shock came at the bottom of the box. There was one final envelope. It had been written by my father, the man who raised me. I expected anger. Instead, I found something that broke my heart. He wrote that he had discovered the truth shortly after marrying my mother. He knew I wasn't his biological son. But he also wrote, being his father was never a lie. Loving him was the only honest thing in this family. I had to stop reading. For the first time, I realized the man I called Dad hadn't been part of the betrayal. He had been protecting me from it. The last page contained an address. Daniel's address. And beneath it were 4 words. He is still waiting. I drove there the next morning. An elderly man opened the door. The second he saw me, he froze. His eyes filled with tears. He said my name before I even introduced myself. Then he whispered, "I knew you'd come." I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, staring at the man whose face I had seen in that photograph for the first time. He told me he had spent decades wondering whether I'd ever learn the truth. He had never stopped looking for me. Then he handed me a small wooden box. Inside was a birthday card. It was dated the year I was born. My name was written on it. He had prepared it for me. But it had never reached me. I cried harder than I had in years. Not because I had found my biological father. But because I realized how many years had been stolen from both of us. Before I left, Daniel looked at me and said, "I don't expect you to forgive anyone. I just wanted you to know I never left you." That sentence changed something inside me. I finally understood that family isn't always the people who share your blood. Sometimes it's the person who keeps loving you even when everyone else has told them to walk away. I confronted my mother afterward, but I didn't scream. I simply told her that the truth had cost all of us decades. She apologized. I accepted her apology, but I didn't pretend everything was suddenly okay. I kept Daniel's letters. I kept the photograph. And I kept the birthday card that had arrived 40 years too late. Sometimes I still think about that package and wonder how many secrets can survive inside a family before the truth finally finds a way out. If you were in my position, would you have forgiven your family, or would you have walked away for good? Tell me what you would have done in the comments. And if this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear that the truth may be delayed, but it doesn't stay buried forever. Subscribe to Family Betrayal for more stories like this. Because sometimes the strangest package isn't carrying an object. It's carrying the life you were never allowed to know.